Here's a guy who thinks he knows 5 ways in which atheism fails.
Every system of belief or unbelief in the world carries with it certain implications that if the belief system is true, then those implications must be true as well. One way to show the belief system to be flawed is to show that the implications are false.
That's right. For example, an implication of the existence of a God who is all-powerful and who loves everyone is that nobody would ever suffer. Because if you love someone and you have the power to prevent them from suffering, you will. Since people do suffer, it's hard to see how such a God could exist. A common rebuttal to this argument is that God has reasons for allowing suffering that justify it. However, in order for this to be the case, it's not enough that this suffering achieves an end which is good enough to outweigh the suffering. God would also have to be unable to achieve that end without the suffering. Even if the suffering does produce an end that is so good that it outweighs how bad the suffering is, it is still not justified if that end could be accomplished without the suffering. So this allegedly all-powerful God would have to lack the power to achieve that end without the suffering in order for the suffering to be justified.
The idea that God doesn't exist implies several ideas that can't be true. Let's look at 5 reasons that atheism fails. First, atheism implies that human free will doesn't exist.
No, it doesn't. First of all, an entirely godless universe does not entail determinism. Non-deterministic events are not magical or supernatural. There are plenty of non-deterministic events that occur in nature, especially in quantum mechanics, that don't seem to require any supernatural intervention at all. Secondly, even if free will were the consequence of the existence of supernatural souls, I see no reason to think that would require a big, all-powerful soul. Thirdly, we know of no non-deterministic events that occur in the brain that would have any consequences for cognition or decision-making. We can't rule out the possibility that they are there, but so far we have no reason to believe that they are. So the evidence we have does not point in the direction of free will.
Atheistic biologist William Provine stated, "Naturalistic evolution has clear consequences. Human free will is non-existent."
I don't believe that we have free will, but not because of evolution. Natural phenomena are not always deterministic, so there is no reason to think that a natural process like evolution can't produce non-deterministic systems. There is no reason to think that evolution cannot produce a brain capable of behaving in a non-deterministic way.
Renowned atheist Sam Harris wrote an entire book on the subject of human free will, and he stated, "Free will is an illusion. Our wills simply are not of our own making."
Yeah, but the reasons why he said that still hold even if there is a God. His argument is not just that the brain seems to behave in a deterministic way. He argues that we don't have free will even if our decisions are not determined by prior causes, because if our decisions don't have causes, then we don't really make decisions. Rather, our decisions just happen on their own. That's going to be the case whether decision-making involves a supernatural soul or not. He said either our wills are determined by prior causes and we are not responsible for them, or they are the product of chance and we are not responsible for them. I would say that it is only if my will is determined by prior causes that I am responsible for it, because I define myself as a culmination of all of the prior causes like brain chemistry and life experiences that form my will.
Atheist Anthony Cashmore stated, "We have no more free will than a bowl of sugar."
It's not clear from that quote that his view on free will was in any way predicated on his atheism. There are atheist philosophers who still believe in free will. Daniel Dennett believed in free will, although he defined it in such a way as to make it compatible with determinism, and Chomsky believed in free will. Hitchens also believed in free will.
These atheists admit that if free will exists, then atheism is false.
I'd like to see a quote from them saying that. I believe that determinism, broadly speaking, is false, leaving open the possibility of free will, insofar as you define it as decisions not having causes, even without a God.
Their solution is to deny human free will. However, the fact that you're choosing to watch this video right now proves you have free will.
Not if the choice was predetermined. As best as I can tell, there was no causeless event involved in bringing me to this video. The most immediate cause was the feeling of curiosity that popped into my subjective experience unbidden when I saw the thumbnail that had the consequence of motivating me to watch.
If humans do have free will, by all accounts, atheism is false.
By all accounts? You didn't even look at accounts from all of the 4 horsemen of atheism. At least half of them believed in free will. The only one I'm not sure about is Dawkins.
Second, according to atheism, if humans don't have free will, then they can't be held responsible for their actions.
I think that exactly the reverse is true. If our decisions do not have causes, which would mean that they happen for no reason and are just spontaneous occurrences, we can't have any control over them. In fact, the whole concept of punishment is predicated on the assumption of at least some degree of determinism. We punish people and reward them because we know that incentives and disincentives have at least some causal influence on a person's behavior. Otherwise, what would be the point?
If atheism is true, there's no such thing as human moral responsibility.
Not true. We can hold each other responsible without the help of a god. I'm sure what you mean is that there's no objective moral responsibility, but so what? Why should that stop us from punishing people who are doing harm to others? Even if there is a god, I still see no reason to think that there is objective moral responsibility because there is no objective, non-circular reason why we ought to do what God says.
Atheistic biologist Jerry Coyne, in a speech titled "You Don't Have Free Will," stated, "I don't consider myself morally responsible because I don't have a choice." Again, Anthony Cashmore said, "From this simple analysis, surely it follows that individuals can't logically be held responsible for their behavior."
I don't see how that's the case, given that we do punish people for their behavior. As I said earlier, it is only if our behavior is spontaneous and uncaused that it would be illogical to hold people responsible for it. Because if behavior is not the effect of a cause, then rewards and punishments can have no causal influence over our behavior, rendering them inconsequential.
You see, if we don't have a choice, then we aren't responsible. But each one of us knows that we have felt very real guilt when we've chosen to do things that we knew were wrong.
I felt guilt when I chose to do things that I thought I knew were wrong, but later realized were fine when I shook off the brainwashing. Also, whether it makes sense to hold someone responsible for their actions shouldn't depend on whether they have a choice per se. I'd rather it depend on whether the behavior that you didn't choose is amenable to correction by punishment. For example, if you committed a crime because you had a brain tumor that altered your judgment in such a way that no punishment or threat of punishment could have ever dissuaded you, then there's no point in punishing you. It makes more sense to treat the tumor. However, if the reason you committed the crime is because your circumstances and life experiences somehow convinced you that you could get away with it, then even if that process is deterministic, it is something that punishment stands a good chance of correcting. It will teach you that you can't get away with it, and your example will reduce the likelihood that other people will become convinced that they can get away with it.
If humans can be held morally responsible for their behavior, atheism can't be true.
So the only reason to hold anyone accountable for their actions is because God says so? Also, even if we have free will, in other words, if our decisions are not determined by causes, how can we be responsible for them? How can I have any control over decisions that just occur for no reason?
Third, according to atheism, real objective moral right and wrong can't exist.
There are plenty of atheists who disagree with that, but I propose that even if there is a God, objective moral right and wrong make no sense because there's no objective, non-circular reason why we ought to do what God says.
Charles Darwin stated that if a person doesn't believe in God, he can have for his rule of life, as far as I can see, only to follow those impulses and instincts which are the strongest or which seem to him the best ones.
Well, that's true even if there's a God. If you were doing something because you believe God commands it, is it not because it seems to you like the impulse to please God or to avoid hell is the best one to follow?
As philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre admitted, everything is indeed permitted if God does not exist.
Not by the cops, it's not, and not by your community. Often not even by your own conscience. In fact, the most thorough way to be permitted to do literally anything and get completely away with it is to convince yourself and your community that what you are doing is what God wants you to do. If you convince the folks around you that you are doing God's will, they'll let you get away with it no matter what it is. If you convince yourself of this, your conscience will let you get away with it as well. Theism is a much more effective means of securing impunity than atheism.
If it's true that it is objectively wrong to murder innocent people just for fun, then by all accounts, atheism can't be true.
That's something that would be intolerable to my conscience whether there's a God or not, so whether such a principle is or is not dictated by a God is totally inconsequential with respect to my behavior. Also, you said by all accounts again, but Sam Harris, whom you happily quoted when he said something that you think backs up your argument, believed that there is objective morality without God.
Fourth, if atheism is true, human life is meaningless.
Even if a God exists, human life still has no objective meaning because there's no objective, non-circular reason why we ought to adopt the purpose God has in mind for us. Why ought we serve God's purpose for our lives? Because it's good to do so? Why is it good to do so? Because God says so? Seems pretty question-begging to me.
Atheist Alex Rosenberg wrote, "What is the purpose of the universe?" in his book, The Atheist's Guide to Reality. He stated, "There is none." What is the meaning of life? Ditto. Meaning there is none. Atheist Graham Lawton, the executive editor of New Scientist magazine, wrote a very brief article titled The Meaning of Life. His first line read, "The harsh answer is, it has none."
Why is that a harsh answer? Why is it harsh to recognize that we have no supernaturally imposed marching orders? And what is the purpose if there is a God? To glorify him? That sounds like a pretty silly purpose to me.
Dan Barker wrote, "You and I are like ants or rats or pieces of broccoli, really, in the big picture. We are no different than a piece of broccoli in the cosmic sense. If a human life has more objective value than a stalk of broccoli, atheism can't be true."
Nothing has objective value even if atheism is false, but why would that matter? Why should the fact that there's no supernatural creator to value us stop us from valuing each other? The fact that there's no God to value people isn't going to keep me from valuing people, so what difference does it make?
Fifth, atheism demands that nothing spiritual or supernatural exist in the world.
No, it doesn't. Being an atheist just means you don't believe there's a God. It doesn't mean that you don't believe in ghosts or souls or magic.
Now, that would mean humans have no soul. It would imply there is no such thing as real love or courage or virtue.
Why would these things need to be supernatural in order to be real?
But what we call love or virtue would just be a mechanism to pass on our genetic information.
Why would that make love or virtue not real? Why would being supernatural make them real?
Richard Dawkins stated that humans are survival machines, robot vehicles blindly programmed to preserve selfish molecules known as genes. In a very real sense, if you have ever really unselfishly loved another person, atheism can't be true.
What does it mean to unselfishly love a person? Does that mean loving a person in a way that gives me no pleasure at all? That doesn't sound like any kind of love, let alone real love. Maybe what you mean is that when we feel love, we're not thinking of its benefit for our survival and reproduction, therefore that's not why love exists. But when we eat, we rarely think of that either. If eating is something that evolution programmed us to do because it's necessary for our survival, does that mean that we've never really enjoyed a meal? Did God make eating necessary so we can enjoy it rather than because it's nourishing?
Ultimately, atheism strips humanity of everything that makes us human.
So if atheism is true, we can't be members of the genus Homo?
It denies our free will, our moral responsibility, and sense of real right and wrong.
This sounds like an argument ad consequentium to me. It sounds like this guy is saying that it would be icky if we didn't have free will, objective morality, and infallible consciences, therefore we must have these things.
It robs our lives of purpose and any real meaning.
Why would the meaning that God allegedly imposed upon us be any more real than a meaning we impose upon ourselves? There's no more objective reason why we ought to live according to God's purposes rather than our own. Not one that isn't circular, anyway.
And it slanders every commendable attitude of love, virtue, and kindness as a manipulation strategy we use to pass on our DNA.
That's a pejorative framing you could use if you don't like the idea that these attitudes are what kept us from going extinct. Saying that they are manipulation tactics makes it sound like we are pretending to have these attitudes to trick other people into reproducing with us. But there's no reason they can't be the product of how our genes programmed our brains and still be sincere.
In light of this information, C.S. Lewis's conclusion as he abandoned atheism still rings true. Consequently, atheism turns out to be too simple.
Too simple for what?
To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.